Here's the second part of part 2 of how to make the sawtooth star quilt. And at this point, you should have all of your sawtooth stars put together. For my quilt, I made 12, and each fat quarter should have made one inside part of the star and one background part of the star block. Next, I like to trim these to make sure they are nice and square. Each of your blocks should be 12.5 inches unfinished. So that means once they are all put together, they will be 12 inches. If yours aren't quite 12.5 inches, that's totally fine. Just try to trim off any edges that are sticking out really far, or just trim them all down to the same size, so maybe 12.25 inch. With the 12 blocks, I'm doing a 3x4 layout, so I have 4 rows that are 3 blocks each. I am suggesting that you do lay them all out beforehand, because this way you can kind of make sure not too many of the same patterns are close together, unless you want them to be, and just that you like the overall look of how your quilt is going to finish. And then I like taking a picture and putting it in black and white. This way you can kind of see how much the tones are balancing out, and you can rearrange if necessary. I also like having the picture in case I kind of lose track of my blocks and they get misplaced, so that I can reference it. Once you have your layout picked, you can start putting these together. So I like to do rows first, so I just kind of stack them up to keep track of them. I like to stack all of my rows at once, and then I just bring it all to my machine and start piecing them together. But if you're a little afraid you'll lose track of what goes where, you could totally just keep your layout laid out on a table or the floor or wherever you have it, and just do 2 at a time. To begin putting your rows together, you're going to want to place 2 stars right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch from the edge. And make sure that the points of your stars, those seams are lining up. So these are pressed open at this point. So I just make sure these line up really nicely so that the points are lined up, and you can pin or clip them in place, and then we're going to sew along that edge. If you are having a hard time with sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I suggest trying a 1/4 inch foot for your machine, or getting some tape and placing it a 1/4 inch so that you can kind of follow that as a guide. I have both on my Amazon storefront. Anyway, here I am just placing pins in where my points meet and where those seams line up before sewing it. I don't know if it's really necessary, but I do a little back stitch on this part of the process. We will be going over this seam again when you put the rows together. I like to just give it a little extra security at this point, and then I go along and sew these together. And then I will add the 3rd star in this row and do the same process, matching up the end of these 2 pieces with the 3rd star. And I will repeat this with all 4 rows. Once my rows are put together, I like to lay out my layout again, and then we will begin putting the rows together. I like to do rows 1 and 2, attach those, and then 3 and 4, attach those together. So then you have 2 halves, and then I put the 2 halves together to finish what is called the quilt top. And the quilt top is just your top piece. It's usually the more decorative side of the quilt. To put my rows together, I like to press the seams in alternating directions again so I can use nesting seams. So I went ahead and did that. So you'll see here, this seam is pressed to the left on the bottom and then the right on the top, and then place the rows right sides together. And I am going to make sure that the blocks are lining up and I nest those seams. I'll follow the same process that I did in the last video, where I kind of try to make them click together, and I play around with it until it feels nice. And then I will put a pin or clip in that spot to hold it in place while I take it to my sewing machine. You could also make sure that the points of the stars are lining up here, and you could kind of twist those if you want, or press them open. Whatever process you want to follow, you'll kind of get into the groove of things. And then we are going to sew a line along that long edge, attaching these 2 rows. I don't really have any advice here. I do a little back stitch at the beginning and the end of sewing the seam. And since this is a longer seam, I do check along the way that things are still lining up and evenly placed. Make sure to remove your pins before getting to them. I don't risk it. I don't sew over my pins ever. Once you have finished sewing the rows together, I like to press the seam open. Here you'll see I have rows 1 and 2 put together, and then rows 3 and 4 put together. And what I'm going to do is place them right sides together and sew them along the long edge. And we are going to have a finished quilt top after we sew this. Again, I line up those seams nice, pin or clip them in place, and sew along that long edge. Then press it open when you are done. That is it. After you do that, you should have a finished quilt top. Your quilt is finally starting to come together and look like, well, a quilt. I love to take a picture at this point because it's very exciting. And next we will learn how to actually quilt this thing.